The Constitution of the Union of South Africa was formulated amidst much controversy. The dust of the Anglo-Boer War had barely settled. Representations from the precursor to the African National Congress were ignored, and mistrust smouldered between the English liberals of the Cape and the conservatives of the former Boer republics. One of the compromises which emerged was the entrenchment of two clauses which could only be changed by a two-thirds majority of both Houses of Parliament sitting together. The first guaranteed the equal status of English and Afrikaans as official languages. The second preserved in the Cape a non-racial franchise. This franchise was diminished in 1936 by the removal of African men to a separate voters' roll, with the right only to elect 3 white representatives to Parliament. In 1948, the National Party government began attempts to remove the rights of coloured voters. After the appeal court frustrated the first 2 attempts to do this, the government published the Senate bill, which aimed to enlarge the Senate and to replace proportional representation with a winner-takes-all system. The effect of the bill would be to pack the Senate with National Party supporters, giving the government the two-thirds majority required to change the entrenched clauses of the Constitution.
It was an awful thing that the government did in those days. I mean, it was absolutely crooked, trying to pack the Senate because they needed a two-thirds majority of both Houses of Parliament sitting together in order to get rid of one of the entrenched clauses in the Constitution, which this was, the coloured voters on the common roll, and they couldn't do it. They didn't have that kind of majority. So they were going to pack the Senate.
The week after the Senate bill was first read, 6 middle-class white housewives held a tea party in Johannesburg. One was Jean Sinclair, the mother of Sheena Duncan. The other, who took the lead in this, was Mrs. Ruth Foley. They weren't very politically minded, but they were incensed at what was happening. And Mrs. Foley said, "We can't sit still and let this happen. We must show what we believe. There must be thousands of people who agree with us, and we must get together."
We went to Fish Hook every year with 5 children in the car, which was ghastly. It took 3 days to get to Cape Town. And coming back, the Senate bill had been introduced into Parliament. The coloured people had had the vote for 104 years, and this government saw fit to remove them from the voters' roll. And this, I was always furious, but I was more than furious then, and the children kicking up a din in the back of the car and everything else. It was a terrible trip. Well, anyway, when we got back home on a Saturday night, I rang up Ruth Foley and I said, "We've got to do something." So we arranged 5 of us to meet at Ruth's house on Sunday morning. We decided at this meeting on Sunday morning that we would get women to march to the City Hall from the Scottish War Memorial in just outside Joubert Park. So we all undertook to ring up 5 people and ask them to march, and for them to ask 5 others of their friends, and so on, till we got as many as possible. And on the Wednesday at midday, I think we started to gather anyway outside at the Scottish War Memorial. We had 2,500 women. And we marched to the City Hall. When we got there, we had to stand outside the post office because the place was packed. During the following week, so many women rang me up to know what I was going to do now. So then I called a meeting for the following Friday in my house. Well, we formed ourselves into an organization known as the Women's Defence of the Constitution League. Very grand it was.
The organization grew rapidly. Women from all over the country rallied to the call to defend the Constitution. They had different reasons for doing so.
My reason for joining was that I considered apartheid was morally indefensible.
At first I was very cagey because I've got an Afrikaner husband and I was very into building bridges with the right wing through my connections, family connections, and I felt it was going to be alienating on that side, and I must just be a little bit careful. Husband wasn't saying anything about it at all. I don't think he knew. He wasn't showing an interest in it. But I was anxious about it. And then, so I held back for a few months. And then the Group Areas Act came along. And that got my goat extremely badly. I didn't want to see neighbours moved away. I wanted my children growing up in a mixed neighbourhood where they would meet everyone and not be frightened of each other and have friends of all sorts.
Government in power was just becoming really fanatical. They had taken the coloured people off the voters' roll by blatantly packing the Senate so that they could get their 2/3 majority by the skin of their teeth. And I suppose one felt one should do something to at least demonstrate that we weren't with them, even if we couldn't get rid of them.
My parents suddenly became militantly Jewish at the time of Hitler. My father, I remember, in the dining room, put on his hat and said, "Today I am a Jew." And I started meeting German refugees because my parents were helping refugees to get established in South Africa. And through them, I learnt about how the terrible things that can happen if you just take no notice of what is happening. And I've done that all my life in South Africa. I've really taken everything for granted, that coloured and black people were there to do one's bidding. I regretted the fact that they seemed to be in poverty, but I didn't really think it was anything to do with me. And finally, the penny dropped, and I realized that you can't just divorce the question of poverty from the political ideology. I heard about the Women's Defence of the Constitution League, and I had my grave doubts about that too, because I didn't know that the Constitution was worth defending, actually. But there were two very important entrenched clauses, and one couldn't altogether reject the entire Constitution.
I joined because there was a feeling of repugnance over what the government was doing to our black fellow South Africans.
I was always involved in politics, and I was in the United Party, and I didn't like what the United Party was doing or wasn't doing, and I got out of it, and I was absolutely delighted to have the Black Sash to join, to give me an opportunity to express my political beliefs and to act on them.
Now, I can remember so clearly when we had the first meeting in Cape Town to launch the Sash. It was my husband's birthday, and we were having a dinner party, and the phone rang, and it was Noel Robb. And she said, "You know, we're having a public meeting in the City Hall tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we'd like you to chair the meeting." I said, "You must be out of your mind." I said, "I've never taken a meeting in my life." And I phoned back and said, "Look, I'll take the meeting, but you must realize that I have never spoken in public before." Well, it was a very successful meeting, attended by a wonderful lot of women there who were very anxious to join and carry on with the Sash. Now, that meeting I took at 11 o'clock. By 2 o'clock, my telephone was tapped.
It was clear at that first meeting, to me, that a number of people who were joining because of their concerns that the constitutional safeguards were being undermined, and that they didn't recognize that the real issue was whether or not people should take away the rights of coloured and black people.
Then began a great campaign to collect signatures. The women went from shop to shop, from office to office, collecting signatures. Branches sprung up all over the country. Tables were set up in every suburb. In Cape Town, they went right round the peninsula, from Simonstown back and back again on both sides of the peninsula. Tables were set up in the Strand and Hermanus and Somerset West and so on, in all the major towns of the country. And there was a most tremendous response. They collected 100,000 signatures in 10 days. The remarkable thing was that they were supported by many nationalists. There were many nationalists who were frankly disturbed at the trickery that this Senate Act would involve. They drew up this petition to present to the Prime Minister and the Governor-General. The women then went to Pretoria. Parliament had risen and the ministers were all in Pretoria. 1,000 women went to Pretoria and marched to the Union buildings where they offered their petition to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister wouldn't meet them, but one of the cabinet ministers, Mr. Ben Schoeman, did. And they presented their petition, and then most of them had to go home, but about 100 remained. They stayed all night, for 2 nights, in the grounds of the Union buildings, although it was a very cold June. And on the 30th of June, they returned to Johannesburg and went to the City Hall steps, where there was a great crowd waiting to welcome them, and they got a most tremendous ovation.
But why was it the women's defense of the Constitution League?
And I have always felt that our strength lies in being only women for several reasons. One is that women can afford to be much more purist. They can do things because they think they're right, or try and stop them because they think they're wrong. In the old days, at any rate, they weren't the breadwinners. Now they are, of course. They weren't the breadwinners, and they felt they were freer to do the right thing. The men were frightened to lose their jobs or their government pensions or what have you.
I've been brought up to regard the male as the authority. And I thought, what are we going to do without our men to tell us what to do? And I mean, it's incredible, you know, that I could have been so stupid.
Well, because women are more efficient, that's all, and they stick to a job. I never thought of putting men there. I was working in the city council with all men. I'd learn and listen. I don't know whether I should say that, but I've done it.
The next step was picketing and haunting. They decided that until Parliament reassembled in January, the Union buildings, as the headquarters of the government then, would be picketed daily.
And straight away, we actually haunted. We went to the Union buildings every day. 4 of us went to the Union buildings, and we would stand at 4 pillars opposite the door where he had to go into his office, and he had to walk through between us every day.
They actually had enough members then to have 4 women on duty, in relays of course, from the 18th of July, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, every weekday, there were 4 women standing in the grounds wearing black sashes as a sign of mourning for the Constitution.
Well, we certainly used to haunt quite a lot in Port Elizabeth, where the airport was very small and there was only one way in, and it was very embarrassing for them. They really didn't like that at all, in this tiny little airport.
The most amusing was when several of us had been invited to the opening of the D.F. Milan airport, and Minister Schoeman was going to open it, and we'd all gone in our best silk dresses, silk stockings and hats and gloves, as we did in those days, and hidden in our handbags were sashes. And as Minister Schoeman's plane landed at D.F. Milan, out came the sashes, and there we were all standing right along the front where you used to be able to stand. The people were all in the foyer with their chairs facing outwards to watch the minister landing, and there they saw us standing. The police couldn't do a thing. So we stood throughout the speeches and everything with our sashes on. Then we removed them and had tea with the other people, and we'd all been invited, so we couldn't be turned away.
In those days of haunting, your life was never your own, because the phone was ringing all the time, and you had to get so many women there and so many women there.
Whenever a minister went anywhere on official duty, if he was coming up to Johannesburg to open something or close something or attend a meeting, he was met either at the airport or the station, depending on how he came, and we were informed by our friends in Cape Town how he would be travelling. And then we formed 2 rows, as he would have to come out and have to come through them. He couldn't get out the airport unless he did. So Eric Lowe, he came, he was furious with us, but he examined our shoes on every occasion to see if they were well polished. And everywhere we went, Eric Lowe was busy looking at our shoes.
There was a florist shop in Rosebank in Johannesburg called Flower Design, and there were sashes, belonged to the Black Sash. And we worked out a code with them. It was quite interesting. All the cabinet ministers were given names of flowers, and any cable that came from brown or green was from the Black Sash. And that is how we got our information. Knowledgeable people said, oh, they'll break it within a month or two, you'll never manage this. But we managed to keep it going for a full year, which was quite exciting. And we'd get a telegram like this saying, have sent pink carnations by 11 o'clock train on Tuesday, kindly return empties. And then you knew that Eric Lowe was coming down by train, and they would like to know when he was going back.
The train would arrive, and blow me down, there'd be about 40 Black Sash women, and the look of complete and utter horror and unbelief on the face of the gentleman or whoever was arriving, that here the Sash women were. How did they know? And they never found out.
Oh, the ministers didn't like us standing. I mean, that was obvious.
One of them, I remember, hopped over a fence at an airport somewhere.
Yes.
We used to go down to the airport and line up as the ministers came through, and after a few weeks or months of this, they didn't come through to where the cars were parked. They slunk out at the back that we couldn't see them. Do you remember? And we all said, lovely.
The Argus phoned us up to say that Eric Lowe was catching the 8 o'clock train up to Pretoria. So off we went and stood there. And he had been drinking quite a lot. Do you remember? And he sort of waved the bottle of gin and said, would you ladies like something to drink? Look at them all morning. Come on, have something to drink. Here you are. And the press got the most beautiful photograph of Mrs. Lowe peering out through the curtain looking at us.
You know, it was quite ridiculous, the ends they used to go to avoid us.
Another form of protest that was very popular was a lot of people wore buttons saying, defend our constitution. Ihr bitte uns Grundrecht. They had little black buttons. Thousands of people wore these, and they were distributed all over the place. If you went into the library, you might find one inside your library book. If you went to a doctor or dentist, you would find them inside the magazines in the waiting room. If you went to a cafe for a cup of coffee and you spooned up some sugar, you might find you pulled up a button on your spoon.
And in the early days, we did no talking, no writing, no speechifying. We just stood, either with sashes on, haunting the ministers wherever they went on duty, or else standing at vigils with our eyes down, which was almost a holy thing, sort of standing outside Parliament while they were legislating, or outside the union buildings in Pretoria while they were administrating. And we carried it on as Johannesburg handed it over to us, then we took over for the whole of the parliamentary session. We would go on. If they were sitting, we were standing. Well, it was morning, afternoon, or all night, quite often all night.
When the old Senate was dissolved, there was one very moving procession in Johannesburg, well, in several centres, but I witnessed the one in Johannesburg. It was a very moving occasion because it was led by the sons and daughters, or in some cases I think the grandsons and granddaughters, of people who had been involved in the Act of Union. And they led the procession with this great banner, our forebears signed the Act of Union.
My husband made this book. It was a very large book, and it had the Constitution, the Black Sash across it too. I had to have it in my lounge for about 2 weeks because I couldn't fit it in anywhere else there. And then this was carried up Adley Street, and then we must have had about 2,000 or 3,000 women following this. We had a small car with Jessie Power also with a smaller book on that leading this, and we had this open air service in the garden.
Three months later, the Black Sash staged their most ambitious protest against the Senate bill. convoys of cars carrying women from all over the country headed for Stellenbosch.
Convoy to Cape Town, and we had, I don't know, about 100 cars, was it? I can't remember the exact figure. We left from Baragwanath, and we stopped in every dorp, and some of us stood with a black sash on in the dorp to make them see that we were protesting.
After 2 days, a convoy of 150 cars entered Cape Town to the cheers and applause of crowds lining Adderley Street.
They were absolutely marvellous. Everybody took it so seriously, and it was very, very impressive. And I had this loudspeaker with me to try and see if we could keep order when was wanted. It wasn't a question of a difficulty, but that there were so many people there who were coming in to watch us and everything else, just sometimes it was hard to get through.
To be part of it was quite a thing, wasn't it? You know, that this was something we had achieved, that we'd got this public show, and I think it was most impressive and very, very moving.
After the cavalcade, a meeting was held on the Grand Parade in Cape Town. Thousands of women gathered there, carrying flags showing the names of their hometowns and dorps.
All through the days of the joint sitting, which took place in January, February, the Sashers stood picketing Parliament. There were as many as 400 at a time standing right round the House of Assembly.
Well, on the second day, we wanted to get into the house. So in we all went. There must have been 60 or 70 of us, I should think. And we were chucked out because we had our black sashes on. So when we got out, I did ask 2 of the women who came down with us to go into town, it's not very far from Parliament, and see if they could buy black cloth roses so that we could pin them on our bosoms. So they let us in. And we stayed there, and in Parliament for about 3 days. We stood outside most of the time, but we stood there day and night.
Some of them went in and sat in the gallery. They weren't allowed to wear their sashes inside the house, but one woman at least had a black strip of cloth stitched onto her dress diagonally across so that it looked as if she had a sash on. Others had long black gloves and sat with their arms like this in order to give the impression of the black sash.
For 48 hours, as members of Parliament sat in joint session with the new Senate, relays of black sash women kept a continuous vigil outside Parliament. Simultaneous protests were staged all over the country, but nothing would deflect the government from its course. The South Africa Amendment Act was passed, and the government was enabled to remove coloured voters from the common roll. So the first chapter in the history of the Black Sash came to an end. Protest was suspended while the United Party tested the legality of the South Africa Amendment Act in court. A few months later, the verdict was delivered. The case was lost, and the Black Sash resumed their public protests. An era had ended. Another injustice was legal.
Well, of course, they made it legal. So we had these pamphlets on the streets long before the papers had the news. And then we stood all around the City Hall in Johannesburg with these posters, legal now, immoral forever. And for me, that comments on apartheid, absolutely, all that apartheid legislation right through, legal now, immoral forever. And of course, the whole country is now beginning to realize that, isn't it?
A black journalist called Can Tember, a very gifted writer whose works were nearly all banned, as most black writers' works were in those days, and who eventually went to Swaziland and he died there. But he wrote an article after seeing a demonstration of black sash women standing on the City Hall steps. He praised them for what they had done, but he said, "I wonder what would have happened if my sister had come along and joined them." Now, I think the confining of the black sash to white women in the beginning was a perfectly understandable thing, and it was not sinister.
I think we should perhaps make it clear that in those early days we were an organisation of white women voters.
Yes.
When we started off the Black
Yes.
Sash, because we felt as white women voters that we were responsible for all the evil deeds that the government was
That's
perpetrating,
right.
and therefore it was
That's
our
right.
responsibility to do something about it. And it was only in the 60s that we opened our membership to everybody, every woman in the country over the age of 18.
At that stage, what had come to be called the Black Sash had about 160 branches and a total membership of about 20,000. But it nearly all fell away once we had lost that battle. Most of the women had joined in the excitement of the moment for this particular issue, and when they were defeated they thought, what's the use?
But of course, people always used to say to me, do you think it's any use? And I'd say, well, I don't know whether it's any use or not, but I feel I must say so. I must show that that's what I feel.
I think that in those days there were a number of us who recognized that matters were going to get worse and not better in pursuance of apartheid. We felt that the Black Sash was a magnificent organization of women who were really concerned, and we considered that it wasn't enough that they should be concerned about the Constitution, that political morality went a great deal further than that. We were determined that we would carry on, that we would not go into recess because we were not there to consider the views of any one political party.
And my husband came back having had lunch with a leading UP person who had said to him, would he please persuade me to persuade the Sash to pack down and leave the field free for the United Party to win the election. And he had said, why? And he said, well, you see, it might be impossible for us to be fighting a certain act or bill, a certain bill, in Parliament for various very good reasons. And if the Sash, meanwhile, were opposing it outside, the world would see the Sash opposing this thing and the United Party not opposing it inside. And I said, thank you. Now I'm absolutely sure I'm right. I don't mind which of my friends are against me. I know that I'm right.
And we were busy discussing what the Black Sash would do now that the Senate Act was passed. And you couldn't go on forever doing that. So we thought we'd shut up shop. But I got so many telephone calls to say we couldn't possibly do that. So we had another meeting, and we decided then to protest against every unjust law in Parliament and after.
I think most people thought we were mad. I mean,
Yes,
all
they
the white
did.
community just
Oh,
didn't
well,
know
I
what we
lost
were
all
at
my
or
friends, as I told you. And most of them have never come back. Not that I'm caring about that. I've got other friends. I've got plenty of friends.
My youngest son, I remember distinctly, once said to me, Mom, if the things you are doing ever affect my life adversely, I'm never going to forgive you. Thereafter, he came and stood with me when he was grown up.
We found when the husbands felt they were very neglected. I can remember my husband coming down to breakfast wearing my black sash in protest that he had not had any buttons sewn onto his shirts. We didn't have time for anything like that.
I don't think that those of us who remained in the Black Sash could have done so if we had not had the support of our husbands. And I think that in those early days, a lot of women lost the support of their husbands. People were worried about their business contracts and their government contracts and so on. And the membership fell off enormously once we stopped just protesting.
A minority, and a minority only, stayed on. And they decided on a program which the Black Sash has followed ever since, a three-pronged program. First, to educate themselves in political matters. Secondly, to rouse the consciences of the white population particularly about all unjust legislation, and thirdly, to do what we could, little as it may seem, to relieve the suffering that was caused by unjust legislation, chiefly through our advice officers. And ever since then, those have been the three chief features of our work.
It was a monthly newsletter when I started, but I turned it into a quarterly because I felt it would be a good idea to take one issue and examine it thoroughly, rather than have articles on things which you read and then could dismiss. So the first one was an issue on the pass laws, and I have a feeling that it was that thorough investigation of the pass laws in the magazine that it led finally to the advice office and the work they were doing, and the working towards the total abolition of passes.
My husband and I helped Des when she was the editor of the magazine. Those were our precious years in the Sash.
The advice office actually started in Eulalie Stott's Lounge. I was then chairman of the Pandans group, and I was called to a meeting there one morning, and Molly Peterson was there, Jerry Van Silm was there, and from that the advice office was started in Eulalie Stott's Lounge.
And I may say some of those of us in the Black Sash realized that the most wicked laws that had ever been passed by anyone were the pass laws as they affected African women. Because pass laws were applied to African women in the Cape before they were applied anywhere else, the law was passed for the whole country, but the application began to be made in the Cape earlier than anywhere else. And so I think we saw the problem earlier, and that was why I helped to initiate the bail fund for African women who were arrested under pass laws, and which led eventually to the advice office. It was, without exception, the worst law that was ever made. And whenever things are said about the government that are untrue, I always think that the truth, the whole truth, the details of the hardships for African women particularly, and the pass laws, are just so much worse than anything wrong that was ever said about the government.
And then out of that work opposing passes for women came the advice office, which was called the Bail Fund Office, and which was out Athlone Way in what's now Sabront Park. And that was started to help the victims of the pass laws of influx control of all kinds, and to inform ourselves and the public of the results of this legislation. And by 1960 we were dealing with men who'd been arrested and sent to Robben Island and their families and so on, so it grew into that. But it started off women trying to help women. We protested particularly against group areas and pass laws, Bantu education, and for farm labour practices.
The advice office was very much needed by the community in all the rural areas, because the rural areas used to come in to Cape Town, and we were the only advice office who sees to the troubles of the African people. But the Black Sash opened especially to help with the pass laws. And we had hundreds of people a day. Our office in Athlone was very big, long and wide, but at times you couldn't walk through to the door without opening the people for you to pass.
I was working as an interpreter and a filing clerk. So during the time when the influx control was still on, I was working with article clerks of 15 firms of lawyers. That is, they used to work in turns. And I used to go out almost the whole week out of office, working in these, in these courts.
I remember in those early days when I was National Vice President, going around the country trying to persuade Durban, trying to persuade Johannesburg to start advice offices. And they didn't understand, because nobody in those areas had as yet begun to be endorsed out. Whereas Cape Town, because of the Iceland line policy and 5% less Africans every year in Cape Town was the sort of policy, had begun to be endorsed out as early as 1956.
Families were not living together normally. This was the early days of acute migrant labour. Really, there'd been migrant labour all down the years, but it got really, really bad. So wives couldn't be with their husbands. Sometimes a local woman would have to divorce her husband in order to be with him, because she had rights here and he had a job here. But because she was married to him, she wasn't allowed to stay here. She was supposed to be at his home base in the Transkei. And she would get endorsed out for no other reason than that she had got married. We had a number of cases of women who actually got divorced in order to remain with their husbands. I did want to say how important education was to everybody who came to us, how the women would be wanting to come to Cape Town to earn money as chars or as anything, always in order to educate their children, always in order to educate their children. And these children would battle, and many of them get matric and then not be able to get a decent job, because this was Western Cape was a coloured preferential area, and all they could be virtually was labourers. I think we did a lot of empowering in that way. We were angry, we showed that we were angry, we allowed them to feel that they were being unjustly treated, but we didn't break the law. We squeezed the last drop of human kindness out of it.
Do you remember, Mrs. Gottlieb, the day when we were raided by the special branch?
Yes, I do.
Well, I didn't know that that was the special branch. I thought that these were ordinary people. So when they came in, I had to go to the small office at the back there to go and fetch files. Now, I didn't know what to call. I was not afraid. I just used to say, excuse me, boss. Well, what called that papier, excuse me. So they all looked at me. The reason why we left Athlone and then we came up here to Mowbray, it was because one day when I reported for duty, I find that all the windows were broken. The second time, the same thing also happened. So we had to put shelters on our windows. Bars and that, yeah. So the third time, a petrol bomb was thrown into our office. So the owner of the building said,
You've got to move.
You've got to move.
And then we started, in our bail fund office, we started organising food to the people. When Nyanga was surrounded by, well, it was just before it was surrounded by police, but it was cut off. Nobody could get in or out. So we took in 3 huge, enormous lorries, Fine Brothers lorries, laden with mealie meal and sugar and that sort of thing. And we took it in. And the driver said, look, I can't go into the townships without a permit. Anybody had to have a permit in those days to go into the township. And Philip Kasana, who was one of the ones in the car, just laughed and said, don't worry about permits, we're running the townships now, I will get you in. And sure enough, when we got to the place where usually there were police guarding the townships, there were these PAC people who waved us on.
In Johannesburg, also at that time I was there, we had to do a lot of walkabouts in shopping centres and hand out pamphlets, and that wasn't really, it was quite horrible doing it, but we had to do quite a lot of that.
The women of the Black Sash were prolific pamphleteers. They also created a particular style of street demonstration, the stand, an enduring activity aimed at disturbing the complacency of white South Africa.
We stood on every possible occasion, any rotten bit of legislation that came up in Parliament, or anything awful that was said in any public committee, the city council and the provincial council and parliament and anywhere else, or public statements.
I used to actually like standing, not because one liked
I liked standing.
Showing oneself off in that way, but it was an opportunity to stand up and be counted.
Yes.
Which we didn't get anywhere else. None of the political parties gave you that opportunity, really, to express your political beliefs.
Oh, they more or less chucked you out.
No, we retained our integrity.
We
didn't have to be pragmatic in any way because we weren't looking for power. We could say what we thought, and it was a marvellous opportunity to do so, which we did.
And in those days, we always stood with our heads bent. And behind me there was a mum and a little boy on a seat, and he was asking questions. Yes, what are these ladies, what are they doing? And his mother said, shh, you'll wake them up.
And I think it's quite funny that in those days we used to stand with hats and gloves. The ladies of the Black Sash.
Yes, we were the ladies of the Black Sash, and so tidy with the gloves on up to our elbows if we had short sleeves on and all the rest of it.
They used to come at every single stand with their long-distance cameras, their lenses that went on forever, and take pictures of us from every angle. They were harassing and intimidating us.
Yes, well, it didn't intimidate me. I couldn't care a damn what they did with their cameras. Or what they did. If they wanted to arrest me, they were welcome to do it. I thought that would be marvellous. Create a stir. The police came up and told me to get out. And I said, I'm not moving here. I'm not causing an obstruction. I'm here by myself. I'm entitled to stand here if I want to. And if you want to put me in the van, put me in the van.
As far as I remember, there weren't very many members in Port Elizabeth. We used to have our monthly meetings in a lounge about this size, and that was the whole area. There weren't an awful lot of people, and it wasn't a very popular thing to belong to the Black Sash. It was really quite tough in Port Elizabeth. I mean, all the people I knew at that stage were saying, oh, you're going to be arrested if you do this, and you're taking something like taking food to the prisoners' families outside the jail was considered to be frightfully dangerous, you know, that sort of thing. And I remember when I first joined, having to do an all-night stand, and that's what one had to do in those days, and it was an hour on and an hour off. And at the end of that long night, I remember thinking, well, what kind of organisation have I joined? What is it really? What have we really achieved? And very early in the morning, I was standing outside the City Hall in Port Elizabeth, and a man came up on his way to work and lifted his hat and said, "Thank you for what you're doing for my people." And it was really so moving. I thought, no, I really do want to go on belonging to Sash.
I think the main thing for me was the protest and being able to stand up, and this strong sense of injustice is what was happening to people whose vote was going to be taken away, whose then their voice would be taken away as well. And that to me was the most important, and has been all through these years, to be able to protest. And the marvellous feeling amongst the people you were with, which I think has really been one of Sash's great strengths.
The last great stand of the early years was the protest against the Sabotage Bill. 4 women began a vigil around the flame of freedom, which they lit outside the Johannesburg City Hall. The demonstration grew until a huge circle of Sash women stood guard over the flame.
We stood there, I think, several days, wasn't it? Days and nights.
It went on for about 3 weeks, all the time.
And we stood there with the flame of freedom, and round the open space in front were crowds of people. And I can remember a father lifting up a child to say, "Look, watch what is being done here." But the policemen used to stand round and laugh, because they used to throw things at us. Eggs, fish, cabbages, anything.
Make us do.
And even when we were marching, they used to throw things at us.
Tell about the stand for the Sabotage Act. I was away at the time and I wasn't there, but that was the time when there was all that violence.
We had the flame of freedom on the City Hall steps, and I was standing there. We stood round it. Well, these people, the Pretoria students, used to come over that one stand. They came over and they put all their cigarette stumpies ends into the fountain. And that made me furious.
Have you heard that word before?
Oh dear. Yes, well, you know, I don't regret any of it.